this is not being driven by broad-based public movement. It's in fact being largely driven by a small group of people within the organisation who are concentrated in certain areas, and an over-representation of people with these views within a certain social class that happens to coincide with people running these organisations, right? So I don't think it's ever really been the case that there's this broad social movement pushing DEI.
We're here to talk about a publication we launched last week called Business Means Business: Why Corporates Should Avoid Social Activism. And we're gathered here today with the two co-authors of that report. Let me first start with Simon Cowan. Again, many of you would be familiar with Simon's work. He's head of our research programs here at CIS. And among his many CIS papers are Attitudes to a Post-COVID Australia and Millennials and Super: The Case for Voluntary Superannuation. Please welcome Simon. And Emilie Dye is a marketing and research analyst for the intergenerational program here at CIS. We created the intergenerational program just a year or two ago because one of the big issues for us going forward is why is it that so many young people, millennials and Gen Z in this country at least, are increasingly moving to the left side of politics? Not necessarily the case in North America and across Western Europe, but it is the case here in Australia. Among Emilie's publications, housing is becoming a pipe dream for young Australians. And how true is that? Please welcome Emilie. Let's just start with the polling that we conducted. Simon, just tell us about the polling. Why did we do it and what is it about?
Yeah, so we polled 2,500 people, 1,000 employees, 1,000 customers and 500 shareholders. The aim was to try and get a sense of attitudes and beliefs in relation to activism. We also asked about some charitable works. We asked about political donations. One of the things that we tried to do here to distinguish what we're doing from previous examples of polling is this wasn't focused on one issue. So you see a lot of ESG polling in particular, and it comes out in the wake of a particularly controversial vote or public issue. So we saw some, for example, following the Voice referendum, but it was very much focused on those particular issues, whether that's right or wrong. What we wanted to get a sense of is what's motivating the push towards corporate social responsibility, ESG, how do people feel about it? And interestingly enough, from our perspective, even just how many people are aware of what's going on.
Yeah. Well, let's go through some of the key findings. Emilie, question: to what extent do employees and shareholders follow the activism of their employer or the companies where they hold shares?
They don't really.
They don't?
Yeah, they don't pay attention, which I found quite shocking. Among employees, it was less than 15% closely follow the activism at their own companies. That's where they work. And they should know, or you would expect them to know. They would be the group that would be most likely to know, but they don't. And for shareholders, it's less than 10% that they invested money in these companies, and they are paying attention to the activism where they've invested their money. Between 60 and 65% of shareholders and employees have no idea. They're not paying any attention at all. They don't know whether their companies are even involved in it, or they, yeah. So there's just a real lack of awareness.
And what about, Simon, corporate support for not political parties, then causes and movements? To what extent do they align with the personal opinions of staff and, say, shareholders?
Interesting enough, they don't really align. So you see it's about 60 to 65% of people respond that they infrequently or never align with the views taken by the corporates. So, and that holds true both for employees and for shareholders. The sense that this is being driven by a significantly sized or broadly supported group of people, either in staff or in the shareholding, just simply isn't the case. What we see from our results is this is being driven by a relatively small minority of people within the company, and particularly at the managerial level.
Yeah, but don't the shareholders and the employees have an agency issue here?
Well, 100%, but that is the problem. The problem is the agency issue. So as large corporations in particular have become further and further divorced from, one, their shareholders, but even to an extent their employees. You think there are hundreds of thousands of employees at some of Australia's big companies. The further the management gets divorced from the shareholders, the further they are away from their employees, the harder it is for those shareholders in particular to exert any real control or supervision on these shareholders, follow these shareholders on these managers. And part of the reason why we're seeing, I think, a growth in ESG initiatives is that lack of control and oversight.
Emilie, employees who don't like what their company is doing on any particular issue, how likely are they to leave their form of employment?
There's also a very small number of people that actually leave or take action at all because of this. Less than 6% across the board are willing to leave because of corporate activism or have left because of corporate activism. It is higher among younger generations. So your millennials and Gen Zs, between 10 and 11% report having left a company because of corporate activism, while with Gen Xers and Boomers, it's between 3 to 4%. That said, younger generations also tend to leave companies at much higher rates than previous generations.
Right.
We're much more mobile. So it's really hard to say how much of a real impact that has had. It seems like a relatively small number.
So many good findings in this report. I just want to refer to one, Simon, and get your reaction to it. Quote, more than twice as many consumers said they were much less likely to purchase from a company they disagreed with than said that they were much more likely to buy from a company they agreed with. Tell us more.
Yeah, so, and that's a little bit of a complicated phrasing. So just to clarify exactly what's happening here. If you are in a disagreement with the activism taken by a company, it's about 20% of people will choose not to buy from that company. For the people who agree with the activism that's being undertaken, only about 10% of those that shift their business to those companies. One of the things that I think is interesting on that, though, is the extent to which there's any longevity. So we saw, there was the boycott of Woolworths, for example, following Australia Day. It'd be interesting to see how many of those people are still not shopping at Woolworths and whether or not the activism that's being undertaken, either positive or negative, is actually having a long-term effect, or if it's just a short-term effect, or even just someone saying, well, I wouldn't shop there, and then they go home and drop on into Woolies on the way home and pick up their groceries because it's cheaper and more convenient, right? So there's a real question as the extent to which this is actually motivating people's behaviour, or if there's sort of a bit of an effect at the margins, but not a big effect overall.
We'll talk about Woolworths in a moment, but Emilie, when those surveyed were asked why they thought corporations engaged in social, political, charitable advocacy, what was their response?
By and large, most people said it was in order to profit.
Profit.
They're quite cynical. Yeah, that was the number one answer. 24% put it as an answer to out of the selection, and 30% said it was like the number one cause. They ranked it first for reasons why people would
So profit, but some might say that companies are doing this to appeal to younger people whose politics are more progressive than older Australians, like Gen Zs, for example, millennials.
It seems like Gen Z is the only one that actually thinks that, which
Okay.
which is quite funny because the world focuses around us, obviously. 16% of Gen Z were willing to say that companies got involved in this activism in order to attract young, politically active staff. However, I think that the evidence that that's actually the reason is pretty minimal. Gen Z, yes, they're more aware of the activism. They tend to be more aligned with the activism, particularly green voters that are Gen Z green voters. They're the most supportive group of corporate activism. However, it's still a significant minority. When we asked what percentage of people said that they thought that businesses had a role to play in activism in the community, they had a responsibility to get engaged in this kind of thing, it was about a third of Gen Z that said that yes, they did. So 2/3 said no, businesses should just stick to business and should not get involved in activism.
Okay, so we've dealt with the so-called profit motive here. We've dealt with the Gen Z aspect to it. Is there any evidence from your surveys to indicate that these corporations that are bent on political activism have any real sense of where the public generally sits?
I think that it's unlikely that they do, or everyone does it so they can get away with it to some extent. If they're doing it for profit, they're very much misguided, and this survey does show that is a mistake.
But in the lead up to The Voice last year, Simon, a lot of the corporations who come out in support of the voice to Parliament. I think 13 of the top 20 corporations in Australia on the Australian Stock Exchange supported the voice, and that meant that the Yes campaign had something like 2.5 times more money than the No side. Where does the voice referendum fit in your story?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting issue, and obviously probably not to go too deeply into the reasons why the Yes campaign lost. But I think a lot of the money that was donated and spent in relation to this was probably wasted in the sense that it wasn't even designed necessarily to have a positive effect on the voice campaign itself, in as much as the aim was to signal that they were in favour of the voice and that this was a relatively cheap or easy way of getting some social credibility in relation to these sort of initiatives. I think one of the issues that we do see, particularly in relation to some of these contentious issues, there's you'll see commentators saying that corporate support's a negative, that it's actually the corporations that cause these issues to be defeated in the public. I don't think there's any support for that. Our survey found that by and large people are actually not super cynical about corporate support as being a negative in and of itself. But what we do see is a lot of people who think it's ineffective, and then a lot of the ways that it's undertaken are ineffective as well.
Let's talk about the staff. I mean, we mentioned Woolworths before, Emilie. There was a lot of reports in the aftermath of Woolworths' decision to not sell Australian Day merchandise at their shops in the lead up to January 26th this year, even though they had no qualms selling items connected to the Chinese New Year. Again, what did that controversy tell you about the staff at Woolworths?
I mean, that struck me as a bit of a PR disaster where if they hadn't said anything about it being an ESG thing, because it probably wasn't an ESG thing and more of a profit thing anyway, they would have avoided the whole backlash. But in general, I don't think it had much long-term ramifications on staffing. A lot of the employees at Woolworths, particularly the low-level employees, are quite replaceable to some extent. And people, it takes a lot to be willing to leave a job because of activism.
Yeah, but you want to have a harmonious workplace, and if there are some staff who've shown that they're dissatisfied, doesn't that send a signal to employers that, or to the corporations, that if they do this again, there'll be more instability in the workplace?
I think it does, but I think that the incentives not to are pretty minimal, or if they think it's worth it, if they're being pushed so much by these managers and so much in this group think that they may do it anyway. And they aren't necessarily going to be pushed over by
Simon.
Yeah, so I mean, I think part of the issue with this, aside from the fact that most people are just not aware of what's being done, so a lot of this is actually happening behind the scenes without anyone really seeing it at all. But what I don't see, at least in our data and probably more broadly, is the case for activism on the other side. So the conclusion here is that the progressive corporate activism is, one, ineffective, and two, probably counterintuitive, or at least counterproductive. There isn't a lot of evidence or support in our study to find explicitly conservative activism would be any better or would generate any better outcomes. So, I mean, part of the lesson from the thing in relation to Woolworths, aside from, as I think Emilie rightly points out, it was probably a profit decision. Don't get involved in these issues, because if you don't get involved, you actually won't alienate anyone on either side.
It just seems like most of the political activism from Australian corporations tend to be left-leaning or progressive. In America, though, there is corporate activism from a conservative perspective. Tell us about that fast food outlet, Chick-fil-A.
Yes. Chick-fil-A got very involved in gay marriage issues, LGBT issues, and donating for anti-LGBT causes. And the CEO made public statements about marriage being between a man and a woman, and it resulted in a massive boycott of Chick-fil-A. But ultimately, I don't think Chick-fil-A ended up losing money over it. When they did the stats, if anything, they gained money because it was such a partisan issue, where a bunch of conservatives then came around to Chick-fil-A. It became like conservative politicians would put a lot of money into Chick-fil-A. All that being said, the CEO of Chick-fil-A then came out after everything had calmed down and said that he regretted the decision to make a public statement on LGBT issues and ended up pulling a bunch of donations to those activist organizations because it just wasn't what he wanted the business to be about.
Simon, let me push back a bit and just reflect the views of some of our members. They're probably a minority at CIS, but their argument to you and Emilie would be that so long as shareholders concur, there's absolutely nothing wrong with businesses donating to charities and seeking to alleviate disadvantage in that way. How would you respond to that criticism?
So, I think the big thing is there's not a lot of evidence to suggest businesses understand what their shareholders think, and that's one of the findings that we see from our results is businesses actually aren't asking shareholders for their opinion on these matters. They're just doing the things that they want to do.
The annual general meetings, there'd never be any discussion about
it's clear that what they're doing isn't actually aligned with the views of their membership. Now, obviously, we didn't have a survey that was, we couldn't survey the shareholder base of any individual company. So this is a group of shareholders more broadly. But there's not a lot of evidence to support that. My argument in this is simple, though. It comes back to the sort of nature of what a corporation is. The corporations really should be aiming to make the most money that they can for their shareholders. They should be then distributing that money to their shareholders, and then the shareholders themselves can take action in relation to activist causes, political donations, or charitable causes as they wish. Now, if a company wants to facilitate it so it's easier for shareholders to do that, there are mechanisms that they can do that as well. Same thing with employees. You can have workplace giving schemes. All of this, though, is giving the agency to the shareholders and the employees. What you see with a company undertaking these decisions on their own bat, off their own bat, is they're taking the agency away from the shareholders and employees. I think that's the mistake. It's not about the cause. It's about who should be responsible for making the decision.
It's Jacinta Price, a former colleague of ours at CIS, who's now a senator for Northern Territory. She was a major player in defeating The Voice last year, and she said immediately following the landslide victory, and it was a 61-39 victory for the no side, despite the fact that they were Davids versus the Goliath. She said the big business should focus on providing for their customers, not telling them what to think. I think that's probably your views as well. Now's as good a time as any is to say that corporate activism goes beyond Australia. We mentioned Chick-fil-A in America. Joe Biden, when he ran for president in 2020, said, quote, it's way past time we put an end to the era of shareholder capitalism. In other words, he wanted stakeholder capitalism to replace shareholder capitalism. He then impugned Milton Friedman. Now, that stance also echoed the position taken by the CEOs of America's biggest companies in 2019. This was the Business Roundtable. They redefined corporate purpose away from shareholders and towards stakeholder capitalism. And to reflect the spirit of the times, this is US Democrat Senator Elizabeth Warren, who just in the last few hours has come out supporting Kamala Harris for the Democrat nomination for presidency. She says, the primacy of shareholder returns has worsened economic inequality, enriching wealthy investors at the expense of workers. This is why, of course, people like Senator Warren want the directors of the big companies to consider stakeholders beyond their shareholders when making decisions. What's wrong with Senator Warren's argument, Simon?
A lot of things. The first is there's not actually any particular evidence to support the contention that shifting from shareholder focus to stakeholder focus will actually do anything at all in terms of inequality. I think, I went to university 20-something years ago, and this was an active debate at that time. And what I think we've seen over the last 20 years, you can see it on the ASX and elsewhere, is that we've already started to shift away from shareholder primacy and towards stakeholder primacy. And the result of that, and this would be Senator Warren's own conclusion, the result of that is that inequality's gotten worse, not better. If her contention was correct, if this shift would be beneficial, then the past 20 years would have seen a narrowing of inequality, not an increase in inequality.
But Warren reflects a trend in the Democratic Party. It's clearly no longer the party of Bill Clinton and triangulation. It's it's moved well to the left on a wide range of issues, and Warren is part of this movement. And one of their arguments is that they're appealing to Gen Zs and millennials. Unlike previous generations, they're more socialist. And the whole landscape among this demographic has shifted to the left in America. And they're also sympathetic to socialist ideas the previous generations turned away from. So the question here is, do corporations have an incentive to operate in a way that aligns with the ethics of these young people to protect themselves from a backlash?
I mean, I think that would absolutely be a mistake. Yes, young people tend to be more aware of these causes, but in general, I think that these ESG initiatives, when you're trying to make it a positive action, so donating money to a cause that you think is going to then get young people involved, as opposed to a negative action, maybe not engaging in modern slavery, doesn't make as great of a media release. But I think those kinds of issues are where you may have more appeal when trying to be ethical and not coming across as the nasty big corporation that's just out to get a bunch of money. But even then, younger people, they're not that sensitive in their purchasing decisions. You don't have to look much further than the popularity of Shein, which is fast fashion and these clothes that are terrible for the environment, child slavery, all of this stuff. Like, clearly a company that doesn't operate ethically. It's so popular among Gen Z because ultimately, just like anybody else, we are self-centered and we're like, hey, we can get a piece of clothing for $5 as opposed to paying $50. We're going to do it. And we have that less disposable.
I have no idea what Shein is, I must confess. Yeah. One of the things that we found in our survey was, if you ask people who they think should be important when corporates are making decisions, overall their responses were first consumers, customers, which is, pretty traditional response, then employees, and then sort of the general public, then shareholders. But when people like Senator Warren are talking about stakeholder capitalism, they're not talking about any of those groups. What they really mean is government, trade unions, particularly for the progressive side of things. They're not talking about more consideration of customers and employees, even shareholders. They're really just talking about what is effectively crony capitalism. And I think what we've seen in the US in particular is a shift away from shareholder-based capitalism towards crony-based capitalism.
Emilie, what about some high-profile examples of corporations like Gillette and Anheuser-Busch? Tell us about what they tried to do on appealing to younger people on these issues.
Oh, yeah. Gillette, I think another good one is Budweiser and Dylan Mulvaney, who is a very popular trans influencer, which they really just misjudged their customer base entirely.
So what was the commercials? What was he doing in the commercials?
They put this trans woman on a bunch of their marketing materials. And
this is Dylan.
Dylan, yes.
Right, who's a woman now.
Woman, yeah, trans woman.
Right. Right.
And very flamboyant, very feminine.
Promoting the beer.
Right. Which, if you know anything about Budweiser and Bud Light, their customer base tends to be, it'd be like the BV of America.
Yeah.
And so they took a very blue-collar, red state, male customer base, and then got involved in trans issues, and it was a massive backlash. And I think they're one of those companies that that has actually had significant financial costs because of this.
And they can link it to this.
You had people who boycotted, are significantly and still boycotting Budweiser's.
Wow.
Yeah.
So maybe the Americans are more likely to punish these companies than Australians.
Oh, yeah. They've gotten massively punished, and they've ended up firing the marketing team that caused it.
Wow.
It was just a terrible misjudgment of their staff, and they tried to push this on a customer base that...
And what about Gillette?
Gillette?
Yeah, the shaving company.
Yeah, they've also gotten involved in the masculinity issues and having these commercials that... again, alienated a bunch of people.
Does all this indicate then, whether you're talking about Australia or America or other parts of the West, that the tide is turning against ESG, Simon?
Look, I think, so there's evidence on both sides of that. One of the things that we saw, I think, following the attacks in Gaza on October 7th, particularly at the universities, and the response to that with the encampments, but also the targeting of Jewish students and businesses, is that drove a rethink of a number of corporates about what exactly the movements that they were getting involved with stood for and what that said about who they were. And so we've seen some of those people pull back from that. We've seen some of the ESG, DEI initiatives that have been undertaken sort of quietly be shelved. Some of them have suffered some, and as we saw, in relation to The Voice, the public defeat here at least drove some of that stuff underground. On the other hand, though, what we do know is that there's an enormous bureaucracy that's existing across the world now in relation to ESG issues, ESG reporting, ESG measurement. And there's no evidence that I can see that is slowing down in any meaningful way.
What about Microsoft's decision last week to get rid of its diversity, equity and inclusion team? Isn't that a significant?
So you do see there's a pulling back, I think, in relation to some of these issues, perhaps some of the more controversial ones, and particularly around that DEI component of it, which again, I mean, some of that's quite radical. But there is still now this enormous bureaucracy that's been built up about, for example, reporting on gender targets within Australian companies. A lot of that stuff is now mandatory or nearly mandatory, and there's no evidence that I can see that component of it is in retreat. So the risk is you can see some of the ESG initiatives have been pulled back from, but is this just a ebbing of the tide because the underlying bureaucracy, the underlying initiatives all that?
Emilie, Zoom, Google, Meta have also cut costs in this respect. So would you take a different view to Simon? Are you more optimistic that the tide's turning, or do you think that Simon might be right, that there's still a very powerful constituency within these businesses to keep propagating the ESG mantra?
I do think the tide is somewhat turning on this, particularly as studies come out that show that these initiatives are actually causing more harm than good to the very causes they're trying to help. DEI is a very good example of a case where they want to hire more diverse staff, want to bring in minorities, immigrants. But these are not the people that went to the universities and learned the correct terms and the correct boxes to check on the forms to show that they are inclusive. Yes. And so they end up being, the initiatives themselves end up being a barrier to the very people that the initiatives are trying to help. And that evidence is now coming out, and I think companies are maybe realizing that is an issue. I think also when economic times get harder, it's easy to start, when you want to start cutting the fat. And a lot of that fat would be those PR departments that are pushing the stories out about initiatives and they are alienating their customer base.
We'll take questions very soon. Before we do so, it'd be appropriate to just put this all in the context of American presidential politics. We have Donald Trump running against what looks like Kamala Harris. Both sides say that these are very profoundly consequential elections in the United States in November. If Trump wins, Simon, would that be a sign that this ESG movement is really on the back foot?
That's an interesting question. I think the conclusion of our report is that this is not being driven by broad-based public movement. It's in fact being largely driven by a small group of people within the organisation who are concentrated in certain areas and an over-representation of people with these views within a certain social class that happens to coincide with people running these organisations, right? So I don't think it's ever really been the case that there's this broad social movement pushing DEI. So Trump winning would...
It's a very elite-driven agenda.
Yeah, that's right. Trump winning would not necessarily, I think, be determinative either way on that issue. What I do think, though, is if you look at it from the bigger picture perspective, and that is from the perspective of, say, stakeholder capitalism versus shareholder capitalism, I'm not convinced that either of the presidential candidates are on the side of shareholder capitalism. I think Donald Trump...
Not even Trump.
Trump is an economic nationalist. He's a billionaire, but he's a nationalist, right? He's appointed J.D. Vance as his running mate. J.D. Vance is even more economically nationalist. On the other side, you've got Kamala Harris, who some people have described as the ultimate DEI hire, who's running basically the head of that ticket. So, I'm tremendously depressed about the US.
Yes,
because
you're not alone.
I see two candidates running in direct opposition to the things that I think are most important and most likely to generate positive outcomes for the country.
It reminds me of something that Brett Stevens told us recently. Brett Stevens is a Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist from the New York Times, and he was our guest last month, and I put it to him about Trump versus Biden at the time, and he said it was a bit like Henry Kissinger's quip about the Iraq-Iran war during the 1980s. It's too bad both sides can't lose. And that's your line, Simon. But and also on that note, Emilie, we should remember that when Trump was president the first time, from 2017 to 2021, that period coincided with a huge support for ESG among these corporations. I mean, I mentioned the Business Roundtable most of these American CEOs supported stakeholder capitalism while Donald Trump was in the White House. So does it make any difference who's president?
No, not really. And I think there's a big push to be anti-Trump among corporations and among that elite.
Even still.
Yeah, even still, for sure.
Hasn't that changed a little bit with the CEO of JP Morgan, what's his name? Jamie Dimon? Jamie Dimon?
I think yes and no. I still think that the support for Trump is broadly a more populist grassroots movement, and it's not coming from the cities. It would be coming more from your rural America, with exceptions. Elon Musk is a good exception. Someone who's very much on the Trump bandwagon. And on Elon Musk and actually on Tesla, I think it's quite a good example of where the people can look at these initiatives and see them for being quite silly or being, not making a lot of sense, in that the sustainability measures ranked Tesla as 36 out of 100, and they ranked Philip Morris as 85 out of 100 for being good companies. So cigarettes won out over electric vehicles.
You always have to worry too. I mean, as we found in relation to a lot of these ESG things, people are cynical about their motives. It could just be that people are coming out and supporting Trump because they think he's going to win, not because they think he's right.
Yep. Okay, now it's time for question time. First question comes from, yes, sir.
To what extent is this driven by university-educated, MBA-qualified staff who have been, if you'll pardon the expression, brainwashed at universities? Or two, to what extent is it driven by union-controlled industry super funds dictating policy to corporate boards? So those are my questions.
And the latter is particularly relevant to Australia, Simon.
Yeah, so I think the answer is probably both. One of the things that we couldn't measure was that institutional shareholder issue, and I think there's a real concern about the way that institutional shareholdings are deployed behind the scenes to impact some of these issues. And I think, one of the things that's only going to become a bigger problem in Australia going forward is the size of the superannuation industry grows, and as industry super's domination on that becomes basically total. That's an enormous amount of financial muscle that can be wielded in favour of a particular agenda, and none of it will be transparent when it's done. So I think that's a real concern. But my suspicion, and it's only really a suspicion, my suspicion is a lot of this is coming from a relatively small group of people who have all got similar backgrounds. I was very persuaded by Charles Murray's work back in 2012, and he did an analysis of basically the sort of divisions between the elites and the lower classes, and the kind of viewpoints that are gaining prominence amongst the elite. You see a similar, there's a book on luxury beliefs, it's called, things you can only afford to believe if you're rich enough to believe them. And I think though that class of people is very much driving this, and it only has a perception of being such a broad-based movement because those people are massively overrepresented in key industries and key positions within industries, particularly around HR and management, that are involved in making these decisions.
Simon, following on from Bradley's question, the first part of his question, when the report was released, I received an email from one of our members, and he said, are you contemplating doing the same survey among university staff and school teachers? I imagine the results may be different.
Yeah.
Look, I'd be happy. So if anyone knows how we can get a polling done amongst school teachers, I'd be happy to get involved in that. I think we have some other things we'd rather ask them in relation to their job. Look, my sense is actually that there are some professions where these views are overrepresented, but they're not as broadly based as you might think. A lot of the responses that we got in terms of alignment, they actually correspond pretty closely with people's voting intention. And so, there's a sense that, everyone who has this particular job believes these things. And I'm not sure that's true. I think there are some jobs where these views are overrepresented, but it's not broad-based. It's actually quite small.
Emily, did you want to say anything?
Yeah. Primarily it would be the not-for-profit sector on that did come out as being more supportive, which makes sense. It's like they're working for organizations that...
Yeah. No one polled our staff, though.
Well, we're not for profit.
Yeah, that's right.
No one polled us.
Yeah, we weren't in the survey.
Next question, Sterling.
I'm not aware that the Corporations Act has changed from referring to shareholders and replaced with stakeholders, and therefore why aren't a whole lot of these company directors in direct breach of their fiduciary duties?
That's a very good question. You would need to take that up with the corporate regulator as to whether or not they took that view. I'm not sure that they do. But I think that's right. What we're seeing is it's not change at the legislative level. A lot of this stuff is being introduced through guidelines and it initially comes into the conversation as suggestions. This would be a good idea. And over time it morphs into, well, if you're not doing these things, you need to explain to the market why, with the implication that the market will think you're a naughty boy if you don't. And I think a lot of it's been a relatively slow process, but it's all been coming in through these guidelines and suggestions, and it's sort of gradually morphed to a common understanding amongst a certain group of people.
These regulators and the ESG proponents must have been mugged by reality last October. I mean, 2.5 times more money went into the Yes campaign and it lost 61-39. Has there been any evidence that there's been a radical rethink in corporate boardrooms about the role that they played in this debacle?
I'm not aware of a particular rethink. I think what we saw following The Voice, and I mean, there's actually people here who know the answer to this perhaps better than I would, as they were directly involved in the campaign. But what I think we saw was this initiative disappeared underground for a while, and then the proponents continued on as if nothing had happened. So we saw, the initiatives at the state level to introduce voices are continuing. In Victoria, we're now seeing movement towards a treaty. The Productivity Commission put out a report. Now, the Productivity Commission, you'd like to think, would be focused heavily on the data and the gaps in Indigenous outcomes, whereas instead the focus of the report was entirely on the degree of devolution of powers and the amount of consultation that had been undertaken, and being told that reporting on negative outcomes is somehow the wrong thing to be doing. And I mean, if the Productivity Commission's saying that, I think there's still a long way to go.
Okay, next question, Fred.
So what's driving the CEOs things? Is it analysts? Is it proxy advisors? Is it the share price? Does the share price reflect positively or negatively these campaigns? And also, when you're talking about the Productivity Commission, it's pretty socialist in looking. You look at what happened with their report on charities. They strongly recommended that deductions for special religious education in schools and school building funds be banned, and the government's come out and pushed back against that and said no.
Oh, yeah. So interestingly enough, we've got a report that we're commissioning that's actually looking at that issue around the impact for investors in terms of returns on this. And we've commissioned someone to do some work on that. So hopefully we'll have more to say on that in the future. So there's no one thing that's driving the CEO decisions in relation to this. I think there's a number of different ways that this is manifesting itself. I mean, part of it is just, I think, fear. They're being told by a number of influential voices within their organisation and from within their sort of social circle, if you don't do this, you will be punished. If you don't do this, you might lose your job, your share price might fall. And so there's a degree to which they're just afraid to take a stand against the people who are trying to push them into doing whatever it is that they want them to do. They see, and this is sort of how you build a movement with a relatively small group of people, they see other companies like theirs doing it and they think, well, I better do that too. They don't really have a good sense, and what our polling shows is they don't really have a good sense of what the general public or their shareholders think. They're only sort of responding to what they see and what they're being told. And a lot of those messages are, you need to be doing this or there'll be negative consequences. You see in some instances, and there was a case in the US relatively recently where a banking regulator said to businesses that were sort of under their regulation, you better stop doing business with the NRA, or you might discover that there's a whole bunch of regulations and penalties that we're going to enforce against you. Now, that was overturned recently at the Supreme Court, but that sort of initiative, that fear that if we don't do this, there'll be consequences, I think that drives a lot of what's going on.
My question is related to the point that both of you made, but just what you were talking about then. Did you uncover any sort of systematic evidence of preference falsification? So people actually think almost the opposite of what they're doing, but because of the reasons you're talking about, there's a very, very strong incentive to actually say, yeah, I think this and we'll do this, to do that. So, and the thing with the preference falsification being that at some point it becomes, there's a cascade, a preference cascade comes after that, in the sense that also it's not valuable to look like the virtual signal in the way that has been the case, and that causes it to rumble. But the particular question is preference falsification. Does that sound like a reasonable framework to think about what's going on with these things?
I mean, somewhat tangential to this, but I found it quite interesting the way Gen Z looked at employment, and in general, they thought that they were being tested on being ESG, on being aligning with these different viewpoints, and so they are then moderating their own behavior in order to match what they think the employers want in this idea. So they don't necessarily believe what they're saying, and they're not necessarily as woke as they're presenting themselves, but they think that they have to be in order to get hired at these big corporations.
Yeah. One of the interesting findings when we asked people, why do you think people do this? Very, very few people thought it was about genuine conviction on the part of management. Now, there are some obvious and high-profile exceptions to that. People who are obviously personally motivated by the causes that they're espousing, but there's a lot of cynicism more broadly about whether or not they actually believe the things that they're saying. And you do see over time people sort of like, I just felt I had to say this to fit in with the trend. I don't actually really believe that.
And Gen Z was actually the most cynical of that generation. So they were the least likely to say it was personal convictions driving this.
That gives me hope, right? Like,
mind you, don't want to drone on like the pub board talking about the voice, but if the voice did get up significantly, that would have just intensified these efforts.
It would have proved that the people advocating for it were right. The other example is same-sex marriage, where the polls indicated they were going to win, and then it happened more or less exactly in line with the poll. There were some significant corporate pushes on either side of that. I think, again, you sort of come back to principles, and one of the reasons why we wanted to do this was to move beyond the individual issue.
Yes.
It's not about whether or not the voice is right or wrong. It's not about whether same-sex marriage was right or wrong. It's about what should CEOs and managers be doing with shareholders' money in their name, and should they instead be enabling those shareholders to take those steps on their behalf? And if they choose to donate to the Yes campaign, or they choose to donate against same-sex marriage, or they choose to donate to the CIS, which I would encourage everyone to do, that is a decision that they should be able to make for themselves rather than have it made on their behalf.
Next question, Patrick.
One of the interesting shifts you've talked about is over the notion of diversity, which it seems even in the States, there's a growing sense amongst even leading advocates that it tended to prioritize certain identity characteristics at the expense of alienating or sort of stigmatizing other sorts of views. But there does seem to be an interesting shift happening over there that's possibly different from here, which is companies are taking stances on issues because of their beliefs in diversity. That was the sort of traditional approach. But the shift now seems to be restraining from taking views on issues over there out of respect for diversity. So Harvard University uses that now as one of its foundational reasons not to express views on contested external issues. And even the Getty Foundation, the world's wealthiest art institution, refrains from taking public stances out of respect for diversity. That's quite an interesting shift. Have you seen anything like that in Australia, or are we still using the sort of former approach to diversity language?
Yeah, it's still a bit... Australia's still different to the US in a lot of respects, and I think the debate in relation to these issues around diversity, it's really race in particular that's such a hot button issue in America, and it's much less of an issue here. Harvard has something of a problem in relation to their race relations, as anyone who might have followed the US Supreme Court decisions would be aware that they were illegally using racial characteristics as a way of manipulating their entrance statistics. Now, the group that was most harmed by that was aside from the sort of diversity inclusions, it was Asian Americans who were excluded so that they could have a more diverse campus. without that particular racial issue, the other one that's the most polarizing is Israel, particularly following the Hamas attacks. And in some respects, the people who have chosen not to speak out against those attacks are in fact doing so in pursuit of this agenda, not opposed to it. And so they didn't want to condemn Hamas for fear of inciting a backlash from Palestinian supporters. And so they invented a new principle that they were going to stand on in response to that. And I mean, one of the few things that people like Chris Rufo have indicated that this movement's starting to lose steam is that the people who were taking those principled stances against talking about potential genocide, some of them have now lost their jobs. So that's positive.
Chris Rufo, of course, is with the Manhattan Institute, which is like a sister think tank of CIS, is based in New York. Next question. Yeah, Simon. Yeah.
Thanks, Tom. My question is, at the end of the day, the board of directors is really, I think, the weak link in your sort of defence of more traditional shareholder and values. And I think the emergence of the director class in Australia, and if you trace it back to sort of houses of learning, places like the AICD, are really the places where if you want to have a situation where people are having fiduciary obligations and not enforcing them, it's a failure at the board level. And if you let a chief executive do what you say they're doing, that falls back on the one person as responsibility. That's the board of directors. Have you sought out, and even I think it'd be interesting study to look at what is in the subject matter of the syllabus at the AICD, which is factory that mints the director class. And now most people that go on boards have got that stamp. And just to see where that lineage comes from, because I agree that you've got a noisy shareholder group with the industry funds, and they're feeding into it, but they don't necessarily feed directly to the CEO.
Yeah.
Their feedback loop is into the boards. And that's the place where you have to have people being very clear as to what your obligations are, who do you owe duties to, and ultimately the fight, the good fight. Is that, I think it'd be interesting if you had a look at that AICD program just to see what they're getting taught on the way out there.
A very good point. So we haven't looked at the AICD, but what I can tell you is that we've got a piece of work that's in the pipe at the moment that actually looks at that issue from the perspective of boards, and specifically whether or not the weakening of the connections between the board and the shareholders by the proliferation of independent directorships and that director class that you're talking about, whether or not that is actually part of facilitating this issue. So that's a piece of work that we're working on right now, in fact. So that's an issue. We're going to have something more to say about that very soon.
Next question, Tim, over there. Yep. Thanks, Tim.
I might answer Simon's question for the boardroom. First is the AICD does actually actively advocate for the stakeholder view, not the shareholder view, and that will permeate things. But the challenge that boards see now, and this, I'm sorry, Tom, will be a comment, not a question per se, but I appreciate the views of the panel, would be it's the relationship between the industry super funds that equally share that stakeholder view and how that manifests itself through the proxy advisors who give every company a sustainability ranking based on all of these, not just carbon, but ESG and DEI and engagement in being good corporate citizenship, which feeds back to the industry super funds and feeds back into the election of directors. And so the questions would be about whether or not the industry super funds have as their core mission the pursuit of investment retirement earnings for their members, or they are correctly engaged in these broader debates. And secondly, the accountability of the proxies, who are very, very powerful in whether directors get elected, and bless them, they look after their.
Yeah. Look, I mean, if we wanted to do another one of these where we talked about superannuation, I'd be really happy. We could sit here and have another few hours conversation about all the things that have gone wrong in the superannuation industry and why. I mean, as Tom mentioned, I wrote a report on why we need voluntary super. One of the reasons for that is that you've got a huge amount of money that is sort of disinterested capital that's being deployed by people towards whatever end they think is appropriate. I know Andrew Bragg's had a lot to say about whether or not the particular interests of the members are being put first, and whether or not, say, for example, running your own online newspaper is something that will be in the best interest of your members. It's not clear to me that it is, but that's an open debate. I think the issue of industry super is one that's worth examining. Unfortunately, for those of us on the side of the angels, we've lost every debate that we've had in relation to compulsory super for the last decade, particularly in relation to its expansion and its continual expansion, taking money from people. One of the real issues here, and perhaps this is feeding into the ESG thing, maybe it doesn't. People do not understand that the money that is being put into superannuation is coming out of their pocket. Too many people still think it's a bonus that's being given to them by their employer, that's been organised for them by their friendly government. And so they just don't see it as their money until they get to the age of 50, 55 and they start worrying about their retirement. And that fact, this enormous pool of capital that no one's paying attention to, that is being managed by people who, may or may not be doing so in the right way, it's causing a number of problems. This may be one of them, but it's certainly not the only one.
And we did ask shareholders whether they thought superannuation funds were a significant driver of ESG. And generally, they responded yes. Around 62% said that they thought that superannuation funds and institutional shareholders had a significant impact on the organizations where they invested funds and whether they got involved in these kinds of initiatives.
I was wondering if you could speak to the broader role that institutions like the UN and the UN Global Compact have on how businesses approach corporate social responsibility. Do you think that, for example, the UN is deliberately subordinating the value of authentic sustainability initiatives by, pushing for companies to fight inequality and justice? And what broader role have you perhaps seen in your research that has on companies and their ability to get that participation trophy from the UN?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think a great example of this is the activist calendar. So you got all the days, you've got your weeks, you got to change the carpet to purple because it's and have some champagne because it's International Women's Day, or so all of this calendar that's very much pushed by the UN, I think, leads to a particularly performative type of activism from corporations, and the kind that a lot of people look at and find frustrating, and they see it for what it is. It's a bit of a opportunity for a PR stunt.
Yeah, I think that's right. And so one of the things that we sort of contrasted in the report is that the smaller a business is, the more likely that the initiatives they undertake, charitable initiatives or otherwise, will have be sort of directly tangible outcomes. So, like a small business that's donating money to a school raffle, they're doing it for pretty transparent reasons, but also for fairly clear outcomes. It's as the companies get bigger and the initiatives become more diffuse, for want of a better word, that you just start to see the replacement of outcomes with awareness. I want to raise awareness of this. And, I don't always have a huge amount of time for the activist class per se, but the activists that I've dealt with, the ones who are concerned about alleviating poverty and elsewhere, they really hate initiatives that raise awareness, that take a lot of money but don't do anything, because, raising awareness is just cheap virtue signaling. I mean, if you wanted to do something, there are initiatives that you can undertake that will have concrete outcomes, that will alleviate poverty or improve education. There's a lot of work that's being done by us and others about those initiatives, but just the raising of awareness or sustainability, that stuff's all just nonsense.
Okay, we'll go to Mike and then Peter. Mike.
So just before the referendum, I had a chat with a director of a well-known West Australian company that made a $2 million donation to The Voice. And I asked them, so tell me about the discussion at the board meeting. Well, the chairman just proposed it and we waved it through. We employed engineers and so that's pretty logical. And I thought, and that just makes me reflect that I think a lot of other boards I know as well don't pay a lot of attention to it. There's more important things like the quarterly numbers or whatever it is. And then on another occasion, not so long ago, during Mardi Gras week here, I was invited to a function at another bank down at Barangaroo, and I said, "Oh, look, I really can't go in there because you've painted up all your doors and windows with love and things like that, and if people saw me going in there, they might think I'm gay or might think I'm going to a brothel or something." And I got a big hand up. "Oh no, that's just Human Remains Department," and in fact, it's the Human Remains Department. I find a lot of these organisations, which are the ones that are really driving it. You were talking about management in general as sort of where it's coming from, but is it really a strong trend? Did you find in the HR department?
Oh yeah, I think a lot of this stuff is coming from HR and sort of those coordinators. I mean, it's something that's come out of the universities as well. The administrative staff now exceeds the professorial staff, and they've got to do something. So this is something. Look, I mean, I would sort of just though strip it back to its fundamental principles. It's not necessarily for me about whether or not the initiative is right or wrong. Everyone has a different view on whether or not the thing that's being supported is good or bad or whatever. I don't actually particularly care. What I care about is this something that should be done by HR or management or companies, or should it be done by individuals exercising their agency? And I think that the answer to that has always been really clear and simple. And you don't then have to engage in the debate as to whether or not the diversity carpet is worth doing or not. It's like, is this something that we should be doing? No, it's not. It's not because diversity is bad or good. It's because this is a decision should be left for the shareholder.
Okay. Next question. I think it's be our final question. Professor Peter Swan from the University of New South Wales, who himself is writing or in the process of writing a paper for us on this subject.
So, what would you say about the evidence that came from Big W during the voice debate? Your whole position is that largely shareholders, employees, and customers are really unaware or don't care about these initiatives. Yet, during the voice debate, customers and employees were so annoyed by these perpetual announcements over the loudspeakers in these Big W outlets.
So they didn't
spoke voice, and they were so demanding that they forced Woolworths to close down this imposition on customers and workers in these stores. So that's the case where so extreme was this voice push. There was a very strong reaction against it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think there's a positive message that can come from that as well, which is, our evidence shows that most people are not aware of it. When they are aware of it, they don't support it. The more that people become aware of what's being done, either employees by the company or shareholders by the company in their name or otherwise, the more they become aware of it, the harder it will be to sneak through initiatives that people don't approve of and don't support. There's a relatively small number of people who would actually take action either way in a particular instance, whether it, whatever the initiative is. There's sort of a small group that will move one way or the other. But over time, that continues to compound to a fairly significant change in behaviour. If every initiative drives a couple of people out more than it brings in, eventually you start to run out of shareholders and staff. So over time that compounds. But I think part of the issue is just awareness. If people are actually aware of what's going on, then they'll be vocal about whether they support it or don't. And
I think you're right. And you were suggesting perhaps the boycott against Woolworths is not continuing, but in fact, I think it is. Why? Because they're selling Australian flags during the Olympic Games, and I imagine that they will have a lot of Australian material in the next Australian.
Yeah, the cynic in me suggests that the selling Australian flags during the Olympic Games is a profitable initiative, and selling them during Australia Day is perhaps less profitable.
Okay.
Yeah.
Milton Friedman, who won the Nobel Prize for Economics in 1976, when we at CIS were created, he actually addressed this very question in the New York Times, of all places, in 1970, and he said, quote, "There is one and only one social responsibility of business, to use its resources and engage in activities designed to increase its profits. But it did have an important qualification, being that business engage in, quote, open and free competition without deception or fraud. And I think it's fair to say that we at CIS say amen to that. And with that, please join me in thanking Simon and Emilie. For decades, CIS has been a fiercely independent voice working hard to promote sound liberal principles. To be notified of our future videos, make sure you subscribe to our channel, then click the notification bell. We rely solely on the generosity of people like you for donations to advance our classical liberal cause. Check out the links on screen now to see how you can get involved.